Now, what I want to share with you today is I think, very relevant to your topic, which is school safety and school climate. The last 3 years at the National Dropout Prevention Center, a team of us has been looking at the issue of school trauma, student trauma in school, or adverse childhood experiences, and how that relates to dropouts, and we've come to a conclusion that I want to share with you. That conclusion is that we've got 4 issues on the table in this topic: dropouts, school climate, school safety, and childhood trauma. And those 4 issues have historically been looked at and treated by educators sort of as somewhat separate issues. You brought 2 of them together in terms of safety and climate, and that's very wise. We've concluded that those 4 are inseparable, and that one, a modification, a carefully scripted modification of school climate, is in large part the solution to the other 3, those being safety, the effects of childhood trauma, and the dropout issue. Let me take each one of them and just tell you some things we've learned and concluded very briefly. On the dropout issue, South Carolina just issued its most recent 4-year graduation rate. It dropped a little bit to 81%. Nationally, we are at 84%. Some districts in South Carolina are pushing 90%, some are in the 70s. But a 4-year high school completion rate, and you might pick up another 1% for 5-year graduates and GED completers later, but a 84% high school completion rate or an 81% completion rate is a disaster. We put a figure of $500,000 per graduate on the dollar value of one graduate versus a dropout to the family, the child, and the community economically. $500,000 each over their lifetime. So it's a big deal. Also, we know that while we're getting through to a lot of kids, we have a lot of at-risk kids. We have more at-risk kids at risk of not graduating than we do the 15% or the 20% that we're not graduating. And we're getting through to a lot of them, but we're not getting through to many of them. Since 1990, nationally, the improvement in the 4-year high school completion rate has been less than 0.5% per year. And that's better but not good. We aren't getting the job done. We aren't solving the problem. If we in South Carolina are losing 18 or 19 out of 100 students that start 9th grade as non-completers with an 81% graduation rate, that's a problem. When our team started looking 3 years ago and interviewing and talking to people and reading some of the research on trauma, trying to figure out how trauma in childhood, adverse childhood experiences, ACEs as they're often called, how adverse childhood experiences relate to the dropout issue, we found that they're almost inseparable. All you've got to do is look at any alternative school, which probably has the lowest graduation rate of any school in any district, and ask the administrator, what percentage of your students do you think have had adverse childhood experiences? And they'll tell you almost all, if not all. Now, the research says in that publication that I shared with you, that I hope you'll take a few minutes to read at some point at your leisure, that's a summary of what we've found. And what we did find was that the research nationally says that at least half of the kids in school today have had adverse childhood experiences. Some research puts it in the 60 and 70% range. Now, those kind of experiences can be specific things such as abuse, neglect, sexual abuse, incarcerated parent, that kind of thing, a specific thing you can put your finger on, or it can be a chronic situation such as continued poverty of the family, repeated evictions, dysfunctional parents that the child has to deal with on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. But either way, the childhood trauma, we know, creates certain changes in children, particularly if it happens at certain times. We know, for example, that the child that's experienced childhood trauma assumes certain things about life that are not healthy. We know that they have certain mindsets. We know that they have certain attitudes toward authority that are different from what we'd like to have them come to school with. We also know from research that the brain itself changes when kids experience childhood trauma in many cases. They learn different types of brain triggers. Certain things trigger certain responses even unconsciously. For example, if I'm yelled at home a lot and the assistant principal comes on the PA system in a loud booming voice to make sure everybody's paying attention, my brain's going to react because I've been yelled at a lot. It's just the way I'm programmed. So we know that the trauma issue is a problem. We know that the adverse childhood experiences affect the child's school life, even if it's several years later, in 2 or 3 ways. One being their behavior. They behave differently, and they react differently to authority. So many of the behavior issues that you've already heard and talked about today, those are often triggered by the child's previous experiences and their assumptions, their attitudes toward authority, and that type of thing that we wish they didn't have, but they bring to us in the school. We also know from research, other people's research, that when a child has experienced childhood experiences, adverse experiences, childhood trauma, we know that in many cases their capacity to learn from the traditional instructional delivery is negatively affected, or even sometimes their capacity to prove learning, such as when they come under stress, their brain does certain things that interfere with their ability to explain how they solved a problem. So we've concluded that we are in fact being successful with many kids who experience childhood trauma, but we're not being successful with all of them. We believe that those 15 to 20% of non-graduates in this country are in large part the same students who have had adverse childhood experiences and have not learned to go beyond them. It's almost the same population. Now we know, and many of us in this room could say this, I had some adverse childhood experiences in my life. But yet, some good people help me work around and go on. But we aren't doing that with all of our kids. So we know that the trauma issue is there, and we know it's related to the dropout issue, and it's probably the same kids. That may be the root cause of this whole dropout issue. We think it probably in large part is. Now, around the country, and I was in New Jersey and New York earlier this month. I'm in Mississippi right after the first of the year working with the State Department there. I was in North Carolina Friday working with a group of 18 superintendents on this issue. And what we find is that a lot of schools are looking at the trauma issue. We're saying, okay, we got to learn about it. We got to understand trauma. And for 3 years, the National Dropout Prevention Center has convened 400 or 500 educators in 3 different national conferences to talk about this issue. What are you doing? What's the best knowledge? What's the best research? What are the best practices? And here's what we concluded. Everybody's talking about being trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive. If you Google trauma in school, you'll see trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive schools. That's a hot topic. But here's what we also found talking to superintendents and school leaders. It's okay, we learned about it. It's bad. Tell me what to do differently in my school. What do I have my teachers and my other staff members do and not do to get these kids beyond those issues so they can go ahead and be successful? That's the big complaint we've heard. Matter of fact, a lot of people talk about, oh, we're a trauma-sensitive school, and we've actually gone and looked at some of the training in trauma sensitivity. And teachers will go sit through a day of trauma training, trauma sensitivity training, and they'll walk away and say, dang, that's bad. They're much more sensitive. But nobody goes back and changes the way they do their classroom rules. Nobody goes back and changes the way they interface with children. They don't change the school experience, and they don't try to alter the school climate. One of the problems with trauma training in schools across the country today that we've found is that there's an action gap. A lot of learning, a lot of thinking about it, no action. What do we do? And superintendents have told us, we understand this trauma issue, we got an action gap. What's the action step? So one of the things we've undertook is to create some action that educators can actually do in a logical and affordable manner. Now let's bring in the other 2 topics, school safety. A lot of the research in school intruders and school incidents has been done. There have been a lot of researchers who've actually analyzed in a psychological fashion the lives and the behaviors of hundreds of school intruders. All to the point that they have coined a term and a category called the traumatized school shooter. The traumatized school shooter, the simple definition is, a kid had adverse childhood experiences. They got to school, they didn't do well, they didn't function well within the school environment. They and the school parted ways in a less than good way. The child blamed the school for their problems in life and came back and did something aggressive to the school. So there's a safety issue. And kids that do well in school and are successful and feel like the school is looking out for their needs don't tend to come back and do bad things to their school. There's 2 sides, as you well know, on this committee to the school safety issue. There's the upfront piece, the hardening of the campus, and then there's the preventive. This is the preventive side that we're looking at. What about school climate? In our model, if you look at page 13 in that document that I gave you, if you look at page 13, you'll see a chart. And what we've done is developed a workable model that includes knowledge, people learning about trauma, and it also addresses climate. A lot of people talk about school climate, but the question is, well, what is it? It's the school experience. It's the way the child experiences and feels, and the staff experiences and feels the school day. Now, the school experience is built on two parts in my thinking. One part is in classroom, and then there's out of classroom. Matter of fact, you can ask 100 people, even educators, what do you remember most about your K-12 school experience, and only 3 or 4 of them will ever name anything academic. The rest of them talk about the team, the hallway, the experience, the girlfriend, the bus trip, the band, the whatever. The school experience, the school climate, is those experiences and the classroom experience. Now, we've developed and we've analyzed all the models, and we've developed, if you look at step 2 there on page 13, you notice it says build resilience. We've identified 5 areas that we call critical or essential resilience factors. These are things that if a child has, they will do well in school. And if they don't have, they will probably not. And we also have identified that these are the 5 resiliency factors that many trauma-impacted kids are deficient in because of the trauma. So part of what we recommend to schools is that not only do they need to learn about trauma and understand it and be trauma sensitive, but then they need to decide, how do we act differently in the school building as teachers and administrators and coaches and bus drivers and cafeteria workers even and custodians? How does everybody that shapes that child's experience in the school day behave differently? In other words, modify the school climate. And these 5 resiliency factors are pretty simple. Connections. Every child needs to be connected in a positive way to a reasonable, caring adult who looks out for them, and the school needs to make sure that happens. It happens for many kids. It doesn't happen for some, for all. They need to have a sense of security. They need to feel secure and comfortable wherever they are in the school building. That's not just safety from getting beat up. That's safety from psychologically not being made fun of, not being asked a question and embarrassed when I can't answer it, that type of thing. They need to have a sense of achievement. They need to believe that they can achieve. They need to have a sense of autonomy, meaning I get to make some choices in my life. Traumatized kids feel that they have limited or no choices in life often, and we need to give those back to them. And they need to have a sense of fulfillment, meaning I can do something positive for other people. Let me give you a couple of examples of how we suggest, and we are training now educators to do this differently. Let's take autonomy, the sense that I can make a decision. As a teacher, I can open up my class on the first day by saying, here are my 10 classroom rules. Any questions? Or I can say, we want this to be a pleasant, orderly learning environment. I want each one of you to write down 3 or 4 rules, and let's put them on the board and see what we come up with that would help us get that. I had autonomy. I got to make some decisions in my rules. I wasn't told. I get to decide. A teacher can say, you must demonstrate to me that you know the causes of World War II, and I want you to write a 4-sentence paragraph, and it must address the following things. Or they can say, I want you to show me that you know the causes of World War II. Here's 3 ways you can do it. You choose. A trauma-impacted kid without a sense of autonomy just went up 2 notches on the scale of autonomy, and they'll be better for it. The school climate's better. So we believe in this model that we first teach about trauma and how it affects kids. And one of the problems with a lot of trauma instruction that goes on in schools today around the country is it focuses more on the trauma than it does on the effect on the child. And everybody talks, boy, let's talk about some bad trauma incidents and how they happen to kids. No, that's really not that important to educators. It is important, but it's not important in the way educators handle it. What's important is how does it change the child's attitudes and thinking, and how do we reshape that to help the child go beyond and around the trauma? That's what's important. Another problem that we find with the trauma training that takes place in schools, and there's a lot of bills right now in legislatures around the country that are proposing this coming up. Well, we're going to mandate trauma training for teachers. Anytime teaching or mandated training is sent out to schools, and I did it for years as an administrator, we said, well, okay, we've got to train the teachers. They're 190 days. These 180-day people, we don't have any days for them, so we can't train them. And the coaches have a game to get ready for, and assistant principals have paperwork to do, so let's train the ones that are left. And so we train about 60% of our staff in what we want to train them in. But yet in this situation, the child's experience, the school climate is not just shaped by the teachers. The training must include, at least to some degree, everybody that comes in contact with a child. So what we recommend is a basic of training focused not on how bad the trauma was, but on how it affects learning. Then look at the school climate. Let's talk about the ways we're going to do, both in instruction, as the way we teach, and in the way we do school, the day-to-day experiences, the way we coach and the way we supervise lunch. Let's make sure that we don't miss an opportunity whenever we get it to build those 5 resiliency factors. In a trauma skills school, every person in the building that works there ought to know these 5 resiliency factors and know what they do and how they can try to cultivate them. And that changes the climate. And if you think about it, if you have a school that works conscientiously to cultivate those 5 resiliency factors, that's a pretty darn good school climate for me as a kid. I'm going to like it, I'm going to enjoy it, I feel good about myself, I can achieve, I'm safe, and that sort of thing. And so the climate indicators, however you measure them, go up. Then we also believe that there are a few basic skills that every educator needs. That's step 3 in the model, there on page 13. There are some basic skills that every educator needs to have in their hip pocket to pull out, to apply when trauma rears its head. When a kid acts out, there are ways that you can prevent it. There's ways you can intervene early, nip it in the bud, as Barney said. There are ways you can hit it early, and then there's ways that teachers can actually recover from it. You know, as a principal, I learned that I had teachers that they needed me in the classroom with behavioral issues, but there were teachers that had the same kids that had little or no behavior issues, and there were teachers that had called me all the time. And there are ways to teach teachers and other people in the school how to do that. And those are those intervention skills. And then we also have information for leaders, because a model like this can't be implemented without the leadership. The leadership has to monitor it. You know, the behaviors in school that get monitored and measured and attended to by the administrators get done. So if I'm an administrator and I want my teachers and my educators and my coaches and my assistant principals to develop those resiliency skills, all I got to do is ask them periodically, you done anything with a kid today that developed autonomy? How do you build a sense of achievement in your class? It probably isn't putting the names of the kids who were late with their assignments on the board. So there are ways to do this. And so what we've done is develop a model that builds this and builds the capacity of the school to become, in fact, a trauma-skilled school, not just a trauma-knowing-about school. Now, another thing is the matter of referral, and that's important. I understand that when you guys look at solutions, you've got to consider the financial side, and we considered that when we built this model. I believe that every school needs a mental health professional in the building. I also believe that you guys may not get to fund it this year in every school in the state. I don't know if maybe you will, but if you do good. But that's an expensive proposition. So one of the problems with mental health professionals in the school is not a problem, it's a good thing. But if I'm a therapist in a 1,000-student school, and I'm going to see certain students 2 or 3 times a week, I'm not going to see all the kids that are trauma impacted just by the numbers. And here's another thing. In order to serve a kid in a therapeutic capacity, we have to identify the child. Trauma impacted kids sometimes identify and sometimes don't. They don't all self-identify. So that's a positive step, but it won't get them all. And so the other thing we've learned, we saw this, Georgia implemented graduation coaches several years ago, very expensive proposition. They put a graduation coach in every high school and every middle school, and they did it for several years till state funding sort of dried up. They still have about a third of the schools down there. But what we learned was that it had a good effect, except when you started talking to the rest of the faculty about their responsibility for getting the graduation rate up, they said, well, we got a coach for that. Must be theirs. So everybody has to share ownership in this issue. So what we've done is we've developed what we think is a reasonable model and offer training. We aren't selling anything. We're a nonprofit. We're just providing service. But we offer training. We offer support for schools. Since we rolled this model out in October, Representative Govan was at a conference where we actually had some speakers and presentations about it when we rolled it out last week of October. And since that time, we've had a great deal of interest in it. I'm already in discussion with 2 South Carolina districts to implement this model. They're trying to to figure out a way to afford it. It's not expensive. It just requires us to come in and do some professional development over time. I'm working with a district in Alaska. I'm working with the Mississippi Department of Education right after Christmas on a plan to do this. So this is something that's all over the place, but it's an issue. The problem is you've got to get to the root cause. And we think those 4 issues, dropouts, trauma-impacted students, school safety, are inseparable, and the solution is a clear modification of the climate, not just saying, well, let's all make the climate better, but a clear step-by-step model to modify the climate and the practices in the school. Be glad to answer any questions.
Mr. Addis, wonderful material. Thank you for the presentation, and thank you for bringing this document to us. When we talk about the teacher probably spends more time with the student than anybody.
Yes.
So to say that a student, a teacher, would need to have this. What about our schools of higher learning in education? Do our teachers get this type of training today in our schools of education across our state?
In my opinion, no.
Okay.
Basically, a large portion of their training is about content. I'm going to be a math teacher, therefore
Right.
I'm learning math content and math
and I
delivery
can
skills.
understand that. But when I was growing up, the word trauma probably was never used. No. Today, our teachers, our students and all are facing so much more than they faced when I was growing up and when I was in school. I mean, we never had this. If you if you were not good in school and you disrupted and that kind of thing, you were sent to the principal's office, and basically if you were really bad, you got a couple of paddings and then sent back, and you did not want to go there. So there was not all of this trauma, and children, families were more connected at that time, and so the society that we live in today is quite different than what we grew up in. But we are asking teachers, mainly, to walk into a classroom with children who are bringing all types of bags to school that day. And we're asking them to go in without any training, without any concept of what might be coming through the door. So, would it not be conducive for our schools of education to take a look at beyond that, beyond the content, to prepare our teachers to be able to enter the classroom more trained in these kind of things, and attitude toward these kind of things and all? And let me ask you this. You only said only 2 districts. How expensive is this training?
The districts we're working with right now to implement this model, we're nonprofit, so we back into what does it cost us to do something. Right now, the districts we're just in discussion with, we're talking about less than $40,000 spread over a 2-year period, because there's a good bit of professional development involved that we would need to do both for staff and for other folks. So really, it's not that expensive. And then the maintenance is simply leadership strategies to maintain all the educators focusing on the resiliency factors and teaching in such a fashion that they can minimize the disruptions and address them and pass them off referral when necessary. So it's not very expensive at all. We found that school people, and you know this, we're inundated with programs and products and things, and they all have a cost, and many of them have a never-ending cost, because when you add a staff member, you keep him, and that type of thing. So we had to develop a model. We consulted with a lot of superintendents and a lot of other school leaders and teachers on this model, and we had to develop something that was doable, that was logical, that was simple enough to be understood by educators, but was complex enough to address a complex problem, and yet was doable for dollars. So it's less than, even spread over 2 years, it's less than a teacher.
So have you spoken to, like, the State Department for this program, that it could be done comprehensively, not just by...
Not in South Carolina yet. We sent out, when we released this model and we presented it at a conference in Ohio where Representative Govan was, we sent a copy with a cover letter from myself and my boss, Dr. Bill Daggett, to all state chiefs. And we've had several calls so far saying, can you come talk? can you come talk to us about this? We've got conversations going on, like I said, in North Carolina with a school district in Alaska to pilot. We've got conversations. One of my colleagues is having a conversation this week with some representatives in the state of New York. So we're in the process. We're offering to do that. Yes.
Didn't you say Mississippi as well?
Mississippi.
Mississippi, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm meeting with the state chief there
Very
first week
good.
of January.
Okay, Representative Loftus.
Let me ask you a question, and I don't question anything you say about a child that's been traumatized. I accept that.
They do.
But I want to share two experiences with you. Many years ago, we had a shadowing program for high schoolers going in to the 12th grade as far as career choices. We also had one for at-risk students in the middle schools. I had a student in my class, in my office, who came to my office, spent the day with me, and he was 2 grade levels behind. He knew exactly to the day he could drop out. He knew the date he could drop out of school. Now, when I spoke with him, I asked him about what he planned to do, and he said, well, I'm working with my uncle in heating and air conditioning. And since I knew a little bit about that, I started asking him questions. I found out, and as far as my opinion, my experience, he knew what he was talking about. He would probably have done well there. My suggestion to him was if you stay in school, you can own a business one day. Now, lost track of him, so I don't know what happened to him. But as far as I don't know about the trauma aspect, but I think it was his inability to, 2 grade levels behind. There was something wrong there with the academic aspect of learning things. Don't know what happened to him, but I'm confident that he had the skills to succeed. He probably, though, wound up being a dropout. Okay. The other situation is very, very close to me. You've got a student who had problems in the early grades. Parents didn't realize that he couldn't see well. Everything ran together. Only found at the 3rd grade. And then that child was behind. That child has a very high, it's not Mensa, but it's close. That child dropped out of school. And the reason he dropped out of school was they were forcing a round peg in a square hole or vice versa. But he did graduate virtually on his own. So I don't believe either one of those was as important as trauma is. I understand that. That probably fit that category. So since we're talking about dropout prevention, what about those children there who just don't fit I hate to say traditional classroom, but the classroom setting that they're in?
Well, I think my first reaction is we need to change. If a child is in the traditional classroom and it's not fitting, we need to modify something to fit them. They need to be a method of instruction, whether it's in that classroom or somewhere else, preferably in that classroom, I would say, that fits them. You referenced retention. Retention kills graduation. You can line 10 kids up here that are enrolled in school in all different grades that have been retained at some point. They're still in school. You can say, what grade are you in? What grade are you in? What grade are you in? Every one of them will preface their answer with what? I should be. Exactly. I'm supposed to be, I should be, I was going to be. You can even ask a retained child who graduated 10 years ago what year they graduated, and most of them will say, I should have graduated in 2009. Why is that? Retention kills graduation. We use what I call a 180-day do-over model in most schools in the state and the country. And that is you go 180 days, we decide whether you go forward or backward. And you talked about the formative testing. That's the reason nobody will tell you get rid of the formative testing, is because you got to have the formative testing to get out of a 180-day do-over routine. It's just a necessary evil, you got to do some kind of assessment. Maybe it's not imposed assessment. But you're right. We've got to do something about retention. We've got to do something about attendance. Attendance is a big issue too. You know, in elementary grades, lower grades, parents control, or family controls attendance. In the middle grades and upper grades, kids control attendance. And of course, then the question becomes, why don't they attend? And we approach attendance as if it were we've got to enforce attendance, when actually they still want to be there. School has to be a place where they want to be, and you can't keep them away, and that's school climate. Attendance is a pretty good indicator of climate.
Let me ask you this, and there's been discussion of, and I really think that, and we're talking about those who aren't succeeding here, but if we changed our approach to let those who could could move forward faster. And years ago, they talked about, well, let's don't have a grade, grade number. And well, we shouldn't do that. But there's a positive side to that. If a child can move up, let them move up. And that would also, I think, would it not, allow teachers to address those needs of other kids who need to move up. And they may move up in a different area.
Well, we've categorized, compartmentalized, and listed kids in groups for our record-keeping convenience, for the most part. And then we say, well, you're supposed to be in this grade. That's why the kid says, well, I was supposed to be in the 9th grade, or whatever. So you're exactly right.
Mr. Addis, thank you so much for bringing this. We have one more speaker that we want to get in today and everything, but thank you for in-depth presentation and also for the printed material that
Thank you for
brought
the
us.
opportunity. If I or the center can ever be of assistance, we're glad.